Hey there YouTube, Arbiner69 here, and today we have something a little bit different. Yes, we have a Sega Game Gear. Now, over in the UK here, these came out in 1991, and as a child I was lucky enough to have one of these. Now, they were plagued with bad capacitors, and unfortunately, as time's got on, those capacitors have failed. There was a number of electronics back in the 90s that all had these, and are all now suffering the same symptom. Now, the problem with these is, as the capacitors goes, it can cause problems with the power distribution board, the sound, or the screen. Now, this one, I think it's the power board that has gone, but we're going to have a look at repairing it, because when you turn it on, there is nothing at all. Now, I am lucky enough to have a second Game Gear, and that one is functioning. It has the original capacitors on, and I will fire that up in a second just so to show you what it looks like. The screen's a little on the dim side, so I think the capacitors are starting to go, but we're not going to touch that one. This is the one we're going to work on. Now, before we go any further, full disclaimer, if you do follow this video and want to do this repair yourself on your own Game Gear, this is done at your own risk. I carry no responsibility and no comeback on me if you break your Game Gear. It is possible. So let's fire up the original Game Gear, the second one I've got, and have a look at how that one looks at the moment. So this is my other Sega Game Gear. This one is fully functioning and working with the original capacitors. And as you can see in the back here, I have installed the 6 AA batteries that it takes to power this thing. It is unfortunately power hungry. And that is due to the fact that the screen on these is actually backlit by a tube. Not very power efficient, but there you go. I have a copy of Alien 3. So we will pop this in, power it on, and there you can see. The screen isn't the best, it is quite dim. But that's now working fine. So, if we take the batteries out and power up the other one, we'll see what happens. So this is the other Game Gear that I bought off eBay. This is the faulty one. Again, I have put exactly the same batteries in, all 6 of them. We will test with exactly the same game, the Alien 3 game, so we'll pop that in, like so. If we power it on, we get nothing. No red light, no screen, absolutely nothing. And I think it is the capacitors in the power board that have gone, but we're going to replace all of them, the sound, the main board and the power board. But as a double check, I also do have an original Sega Game Gear power adapter. I will plug this in and we'll try that and see if it makes a difference. So there we are, we have the mains power plugged in now. We have the batteries out and we still have the original Alien 3 game in the back there. And if we turn that on, we still get nothing. No power, no screen, no sound, absolutely nothing. So the next thing to do is start taking it apart. So we'll have a look at what tools we'll be using for this mod, and we'll crack on with it. Okay, so here's everything that I've prepared ready for this this work. We may not need everything, but I'd rather have everything ready just in case. So we've got the Sega Game Gear. We have the capacitors ready to replace. These were bought off eBay, and I'll put a link for them in the description below. We have a solder pen. We have desoldering wick and solder with a resin core. I have a security bit screwdriver for that one security screw in the Game Gear, a Phillips screwdriver, needle nose pliers, a plastic pointer, a pair of tweezers and a soldering iron. And that is everything we should need for this. So let's start by opening the Sega Game Gear up. Now before we start, what I will say is if your Game Gear is in decent condition, the screen is good, put a cloth down, don't work on a hard surface, but the screen on this one is in poor condition, so if this works I will be replacing the screen. So that is the security screw. We'll get that out first, as this is the hardest one to remove. Now we need to open the battery covers to get access to the 6 Phillips screws, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. So we'll take them out. So once all 6 screws are removed, if we open this carefully, we will see the insides of our Sega Game Gear. Now be very careful, because you do have a wire here, here and here connecting the back part to the front. So what I'd recommend is unplug them from the backboard very, very carefully, as we don't want to break the wires. So simply just pull them up and they will pop out like so. There we are. And now the back part we can set back to one side as we'll work on the main board first. So as we can see inside here, this is the main board of the Sega Game Gear. The capacitors have a positive and a negative side. The next value up is the voltage of that capacitor, 6.3. One thing to ensure is the capacitors you're replacing them with do not drop below that voltage. Each capacitor has its voltage rating. If they're a higher voltage, that's fine, they'll still pass through the 6.3 volts. But if they're lower, then they'll pop. The next value is the microfarads of the capacitor, so this one is 22 microfarads. So when you are doing the replacement, it is important to make sure that you use the right capacitor in the right polarity in the right place. Now all these are surface mounted via the solder joints here. And as you can possibly see, the solder joints are yellow. They have aged, so we'll need to reapply new solder to these. The only ones that are slightly different are these small ones down here. And on mine, they have R47 as the value of the capacitor. That is 0.47 microfarads, and they're at 50 volts with a positive and a negative side. So what we need to do is identify which capacitors we need to replace, and that is fairly easy. They all have this black box around them. And I do believe there are 12 capacitors in total, so we'll have a quick look at them all. So here we are, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 and 12 capacitors to replace, all of which are set as surface mounted. So the next job to do is identify the capacitors in our pack. Now I was lucky enough that when I bought mine, the package actually had the writing on saying Game Gear main board capacitors. Most of the ones I've seen advertised on eBay do have the writing written on the package to say what the capacitors are for. So I've already broken these out and separated them into the piles, as we do have 1, 2, 3 and 4 10 microfarad capacitors. So I've arranged them all in order of values, and we'll start to desolder. As this is a very, very tedious process, I'm only going to do one capacitor on camera, the rest I will do off camera. However, the one we're going to work on is this one here. So we'll make a note of the positive and negative side. It's a 4 volt 100 microfarad capacitor. My replacement is here. Now if we can get the camera to focus on this. You'll see this capacitor has a white stripe down it that denotes the negative side. Also, if you do notice, one of the legs is longer than the other. The longer leg is the positive side of this capacitor. Now the one I'm using is the 100 microfarad, but this one is 6.3 volt, I believe. Yep, this one's 6.3 volt. The one we're replacing is only a 4 volt, so it will still pass the 4 volts through it, so that's fine. So the first thing we need to do with this one here is take our needle nose pliers, grab hold of it, and give it a very gentle twist, and you'll hear the glue underneath it crack. There we are, that's all it takes. And now we should be able to gently tease that up, and you can see it moves. It is free from the board. So the next thing to do is heat the soldering iron up and hit both these joints here with the solder, and this should pop straight off. The other thing to mention as well, what I have done, I have taken a photograph of the board in the orientation I have it on my phone. So if I do take the capacitor off and forget, I have a photograph to refer back to of the polarities of the capacitors. So that's one thing to note. Now I've got my soldering iron here, heated up to 380 degrees. So we will try and desolder this capacitor. Very, very carefully. I've got a thin nib on this. There's one, and there's the second one off. So if we remove that, you can actually see, well I can see, I don't know if the camera will pick it up or not, but on the board there actually is a plus just there that denotes the positive side of the capacitor, and you can see where the glue was that held it down as well. So what I'll do now, I'll use this old capacitor, as the pins are bent underneath it. I will use that as a template to shape the pins of the new capacitor. So the next thing to do is to make sure the capacitor is in the right orientation. Don't forget the white stripe denotes the negative and the board has the positive on it. So if we put it the right way around, now unfortunately these are fiddly, so unfortunately my fingers are probably going to obscure some of this view, but if you rest it in place, just put the legs over the pads that we've already pre-soldered, and once we get one soldered on, the other one should be fairly easy to do. So if we just rest this in place, heat up that solder, and get that on, give it a little wiggle, that's on. Now with the tweezers, we can make sure the other leg lines up correctly. It needs a little bit of adjusting. Hold that in place, like so. There we are. And then we push this one down onto the pad. There we go. And we give that a wiggle. That is definitely soldered on, in place. There we are, and that is one new capacitor done. As I said, these are very, very fiddly, and with my soldering skills do take me a bit of time. If you're more proficient at soldering, these may be quicker for you, but for me they're not. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and desolder the rest of these in exactly the same fashion. Make a note of the positive and negative, make a note of which capacitor you're doing, desolder them, retin the new pads, trim the capacitor legs down, tin the capacitor legs, and resolder them back on again. So I will rejoin you guys in a few minutes once I've redone all this. So I've been working on this and I've got this one, and this one replaced, and they're all now soldered to the board. Started coming down the board to this 22 microfarad 6.3 volt capacitor. This one's been taken off. However, its replacement, as you can see, is much larger. Now this pad here that sits directly behind the capacitor cannot be covered by any new capacitors you put on the board because the backing plate actually touches this. Now the problem I've got is if we put this one in place, even if we shorten the legs as short as we can go, it hangs over this mark. So my plan is to fold the legs of this capacitor back over on itself and cover each leg with a small amount of heat shrink, just to make sure we get no contacts or shorts. Solder it in like so with the capacitor facing the wrong way, and then fold it over itself. I'll start this, I'll get the process done, and then we'll come back and I'll show you what I mean. So we have this capacitor now soldered on. Obviously it faces the wrong way, so now with the heat shrink protecting the cables, the wires, we will bend it back over on itself very, very carefully, and hopefully keep it out the way of that. And that is about the best I can come up with for this one. So I've just test fit the back of the case back on in place, and with this one slightly bent up here out the way, hopefully it won't short out as it's insulated with the heat shrink here. It's not touching any of the components, it is free of the board, and it does miss this plate, so hopefully this will work. But the back case fits on perfectly fine, so I'll continue on with the rest of the soldering and get back to you when I'm finished. So there we are, that is all the capacitors soldered on the main board. That one was a very, very tricky one to do because there's very, very little space. My capacitors were much bigger than the originals. This one and this one again were the same. My capacitors were much, much bigger than the originals, but overall they're all done. I've checked them, none of them move, they're all soldered on very well. And the ones that I'm a bit dubious about, I've made doubly sure by insulating the legs with heat shrink on here and a couple more. But there you go, that is the main board done. It is very, very fiddly, and what I will do is say again, make sure you get the polarities correct, positive to positive, negative to negative on these capacitors. Make sure you get the right capacitor in the right place, and also measure twice, cut once for the length of the cable, the wires out the back of the capacitors, because you do not want to make a mistake. So that's that done. Next we'll be on to the power and soundboard. So we'll have a look at those. So now we move on to the back of the Game Gear. We have the soundboard up here and the power board up here. Now the capacitors I bought, as I said before, came individually packaged. So these ones are the soundboard capacitors, and then in a separate bag we have the power board capacitors. So we'll put these ones to one side as we're going to work on the soundboard first. So first thing we need to do to get this board out, we have to unscrew this metal RF shield. So we'll take these 4 screws out. And set them to one side, careful not to lose them. Simply lift the RF shield out and set it to one side. Right, now to make this a little bit easier, I think we'll take this board out. There are 1 and 2 screws, I believe. Yep, just 2 screws to take this out. Take that out. And that one. Oops. There we are. And this board simply lifts straight out. Now again, these capacitors are surface mounted, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 we need to replace. So here we have the capacitors. As you can see, there is the value written here. This one is 100 microfarads at 6.3 volts, and this black line here denotes the negative side of it. Now these are surface mounted, and the solder joints are hidden just at the side here and just in here. So you need to take care when desoldering these. And then again, as before, pop on the new capacitors, making sure you get the right microfarad capacitor and the right polarities on them. So we'll make a start, and I'll do the first one on camera for you. So this board has 2 types of capacitors. There are 100, 100 and 100, and a 47 and a 47. So the 100s are all 6.3 volts and the 47s are 4 volts. So there's only 2 different types of capacitors. We're going to work on this one first, the 100 volt 6.3. So first thing we need to do is drop a little bit of flux on there to allow the joints to, the solder to flow, just in case. Get in there, there we go. And then with your soldering iron, nice and hot, my fingers are probably going to get in the way here, but if we apply sideways pressure and rest it against that, we should be able to pull this off. If it doesn't go, what I tend to do is pop a bit more flux on and pop a little bit of solder on the soldering iron to allow it to flow. Just a touch of solder, doesn't need much. Then we will try that again. There we go. Oops. That's that side freed up. Now to do this side, it's going to be a bit tricky to get in, as there isn't much space on this, unfortunately. Try not to burn yourself on the soldering iron as well. There we go. Oops, not quite. There we are. Right, in taking this one off, this pad was slightly damaged. So take extra care when taking these off. They are very, very delicate. So I'll continue soldering this one on and we'll see how it goes. So for the capacitor, all I've done is bent the legs out at the side. So when we introduce it to the board, we can just pop it on like so, straight up and down. So now, as before, we will drop a little bit of flux on the pins of this capacitor. And then tin the legs to make it a bit easier to stick it to the board. Like so. And then making sure we get the white stripe of the capacitor that shows a negative to the negative side on the board, which is the far side. And unfortunately you probably won't get to see much of this because of my fat fingers in the way. Yeah, this is very fiddly, this one. So if we rest that on there and we get the negative one attached. That didn't attach. Put a bit more solder on the negative side. There we go. Pop that on there like so. That's that one on. Now we just twist it round a bit to get the positive, like that. And if we press down, we get that one soldered. And that is our new capacitor on the board. It is very, very fiddly to do. So I'm going to disappear and do the rest of these, and I'll come back once they're all done. So that's the soundboard done with the new capacitors on. And the old surface ones that were on there, these are right buggers to get off. They are fiddly as hell. But with perseverance and patience and a great deal of care, I managed to get them all off and these new ones on. So what we'll do now is we'll install this back into the back part of the Game Gear and move on to the power board. So with the back part of the Game Gear, we will slip that back in again, like so. Get the two screws we removed from this board and pop them back in again. Tighten that one up in a second once we get the next one in. And then we'll put the RF shield back on there again and get this secured. So the next thing to do is move on to the power board. So again, there's a screw in the top corner and the screw in the bottom corner. We'll take those out to get a closer look at the power board. Now when taking this out, you'll have to unstick this plastic bit here, as that is holding the power board in place and it's rather sticky. So just a bit of teasing. There we go. Put that to one side, and now the power board should just lift out, like so. Now be careful that you don't lose the red switch at the top here. If you just take that off, set that to one side along with the black part you've just taken off, and now we can work on the power board. So as before, the kit I bought, the bag is conveniently labelled power. So these are the capacitors, and there are only three. 1, 2, 3. Now unlike before, these aren't surface mounted. If we flip it over, they are push through mounted. So when you're doing these, you'll have to take careful care that you mark the negative and the positive the right way around when you mount these on the board. And also don't forget, check which capacitor you've taken out to the right one you're putting back in again, so you match the microfarads and the voltage back up again. So I'll do the first one on camera as before, and then I'll do the other ones off camera. So let's get started. So as I said, the capacitor we're working on is this one here. So when we flip over, it's the two joints here. So what I'll do, I'll try with my desoldering pen first. If we just heat up the area and suck, and then heat up the area and suck. And if we just check, there's one stubborn bit of solder left on the side here. See if we can get this. Has that freed the capacitor? Not quite yet. Let's see if we can tease it out. There's that one. Oh, there we go, is that it? Nearly. There we go. And that's the first capacitor out. Now if you flip the board over, we can see a little bit easier. There's the white line that denotes the negative. And the capacitor we just took out is 820 microfarads at 6.3 volts. There we are. So we need to match that up with our current one. So we've got our replacement capacitor, 823 microfarads, oops, at 6.3 volts. So you can see this one's got the white stripe that denotes negative. So what we'll do is we'll pop this one into the board the correct way around. There we are. So we pop this in, put the positive leg and the negative leg, push them through all the way until we're all the way through, and then just bend the legs ever so slightly to hold it in place. And then all we need to do is apply some solder. One, and two. And that's our capacitor soldered to the board, held in very nicely. So now what we do is trim the legs off. One. If you're going to do this, I'd recommend getting a decent pair of wire cutters because mine are absolutely trash. But there you go. Right, I'll go and do the other two. I'll be back in a minute. Right, and that's the three new capacitors put on the power board. My soldering skills, as I said, I am not the best, but it's done. All solder joints are firmly held and there's no shorts across the board. Now what I would suggest at this point is you bring all the pieces back, so we have the soundboard, the power board, and not forgetting the original Game Gear board. Go through and double check and triple check every capacitor is on the right orientation, negative to negative, positive to positive, because if you power this up and the capacitor is in the wrong place, there's a chance you'll do damage. So I'm going to double check this and then we'll come back for the reassembly of the Game Gear. So with all that checked, it's now time to put the power board back in again. So if we pop the red switch back on, there we are. Slot that back over there and that should drop back into place like so. If we get the black cover we took off earlier, and we drop that back in place and just push that down, that should stick back somewhat. And then the screws we set aside, if we get those back and pop them back in again. That's one and two. Right, and now it's time to connect the two halves back together again. So while connecting the two halves together, I came across a slight problem, and that was the capacitors that I put on the soundboard here. Some of them that I'd soldered at the top here were sticking up straight, and it was causing this shield to impact on the top half of the Game Gear. So I've had to desolder these three capacitors and replace them with new ones, lying completely flat. See if we can get a better shot. So lying completely flat down to the board. Now let's try and reassemble the two halves of the Game Gear and see what we get. So as before, when we took it apart, we'll connect the display up to the power board. Well, I'll say the display, the main board, up to the power board, like so. And then we'll connect the sound wires up to the soundboard. One in there like that, the second in there, like so. Bend it all over and connect it up. Now all we need to do is replace the security screw in the top there, the rest of our normal Phillips screws in here, and test it. So I'll do that, I'll be back in a second. So with the last screw going into the Game Gear now, which is the security screw, get this one tightened all the way in. it'll be time to test. There we go. And that is the Game Gear now fully reassembled. So what we'll do with the original power supply that I've got, because the Sega Game Gear eats batteries, shall plug that into the top. And I'll get my copy of Sonic the Hedgehog, because I'm sure anybody who had a Sega Game Gear owned a copy of Sonic the Hedgehog. We shall pop that in there. And we have a picture. And if I just turn the volume up and hold this to my mic. We have sound. So there we are, that has been fully recapped. And working with sound. So there we go, that is the guide for recapping a Sega Game Gear. So please remember though, when recapping the Sega Game Gear, it's not always going to fix every single problem. It will fix 99.9% of problems with the Sega Game Gear that you have. As I did say before, the capacitors are very old, but this is an endeavour that you take under your own risk, because there is a chance you will break the Sega Game Gear. Now, this has worked for me. I have been lucky. It's the first time I've ever recapped a Sega Game Gear. I'll just turn the volume down on this. Yes, it's the first time I've ever recapped a Sega Game Gear, and it worked well. It was a bit fiddlier than the Game Boy I did, but it was good fun. Now, there are some other things I want to look at doing with this Sega Game Gear, possibly changing the screen for an LCD screen, or if I can afford it, I would love to go and get this Game Gear McWill modded with a McWill screen. But that is expensive, and that is way beyond my skill level. So if I do get that done, I will do a video showing the comparisons between an original Sega Game Gear and the McWill screen. But that is the recap of a Sega Game Gear. Do me a favour, if you enjoyed this video, please smack the thumbs up or the thumbs down button, but please leave me a comment below and let me know what you thought of the video. And until next time, take care.